This is Marta, and I am gonna do my very first book haul. For those who don't know, book hauls are videos where the YouTuber shows books that he or she or hen has bought, and we kind of talk about what they're about and why we bought them, and well, you get the idea.
Unboxing.
Yes, it's a form of unboxing. So let's get started. Alright, so the very first thing that I have to show is Monstrous, Volume 1, Awakening, by Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda. I apologize if I said that wrong. This is a fantasy kind of steampunk comic about a war-torn world that's very Asian inspired, and the main character is kind of like a organic, not entirely human type of creature who also is disabled, and she is on a mission of sorts. And this book, I have just started it. I'm 40 pages in. It's very brutal. Already there's like slavery and torture and actually a lot of violence towards children. So it's very cruel, but it's really beautifully drawn. And it is so unusual to actually read fantasy with a disabled character who's also like a woman of color. So hopefully this is good. So far it has sucked me in, but it's very brutal. So if you are faint of heart, don't read this. Next up, Irinan Koala Mat by Asko Sahlberg. Asko Sahlberg is the most prominent and probably the most famous Sweden-Finn author. That means that he is of Finnish descent and also speaks Finnish. And he, as you can tell, he also writes in Finnish, but he lives in Sweden. I believe he actually lives in Gothenburg, if I'm not mistaken. And he has written lots of books, and they've won lots of awards. He's even been nominated, and I believe he even won the Sweden Finn of the Year one of these days in the past. And this book is actually about a child, a war child as we call them, meaning that it takes place in World War II, and it is about a Finnish child that is sent to Sweden temporarily as a way of being safe. And this is a real thing that happened. Children in Finland during the Second World War, when we were at war with Russia, a lot of people sent their children to Sweden temporarily for safety. And then when the war had kind of mellowed out, they were sent back to Finland. And there's lots of different stories there. Some people had trouble adjusting back to Finland. Some people bounced right back. There's lots of different stories. But oddly enough, in my experience, there's been a lot of movies about this subject, but not a lot of books. And this book not only tackles this subject, one thing that critics have said is really great, like Satu Gröndal, who is one of these experts when it comes to Sweden-Finn literature. She says that this book is interesting in that it actually kind of discusses if a child can have a comprehension of morality. Because this Irina, she does very cruel things in this book, and she even knows that they're cruel things, but she goes ahead and does them anyway. And doesn't really always feel remorse for them. Sometimes she does, sometimes she doesn't. And yeah, so basically this kind of tackles a subject that's kind of interesting. What happens to a child when they're temporarily sent to another country for safety while there's a war going on. But it also kind of tackles the universal subject of morality and like, can a child understand morality or not? It's a very heated philosophical question. So, and it's very short, so looking forward to this. Next up, another comic, and this is actually a graphic memoir by a Swedish journalist called Thomas Androff. And it is basically called Livets ord, del 1. Mina 10 orimliga år som frälst, which basically means like my 10 years being saved. And this is a memoir about a guy who he's kind of famous now as a journalist, but when he was a younger man, he kind of got involved with a cult. Here in Sweden, we have cults too, unfortunately. And Livets Ord is perhaps the most famous one because Carola, one of these big pop divas here, she's a member. And they're kind of controversial because they believe that you can like cure homosexuality and that kind of stuff. Something that like conversion therapy is something that's actually still debated in America, but here in Scandinavia it is not. So it is highly unusual that people would talk like this way. So and Livets Ord kind of sticks out like that a little bit. And there's been quite a few in recent years here in Sweden, like own voices, if you may, stories of people that have been in this cult and then left. And I adore graphic memoirs. All of my favorite comics, Paris Police, Nylon Road, Epileptic, they're all memoirs. So if I see a graphic memoir and I think the subject is interesting, I gotta read it. And I find the theme of religious extremism and kind of getting involved in religion and then leaving an interesting subject matter. So I'm looking forward to this one. The good thing about this is that it's also a two-parter, so I won't have to waste too much money on it if I end up liking it and want to buy more. Next up, this is a novel. Walk the Earth a Stranger by Ray Carson. This book has been getting a lot of buzz on YouTube and on the internet in general. Ray Carson is kind of a very well-loved fantasy author. And while perhaps her other series, The Girl of Fire and Thorn, if I remember correctly its title, I've heard that is really good, but I am really intimidated by pure fantasy. Like the last time I read pure fantasy, it was Harry Potter, basically. I don't really read a lot of fantasy, and I usually read magical realism. I prefer that. And this is a book that is a fantasy novel. It's about a girl who can sense gold in the earth. And this is during the gold rush in America. So there are people that would basically kill to get their hands on her. And even if this is fantasy per se, it still is kind of like set in like America, and it still is somewhat historical. So I am very curious to get to this. I think this is a fantasy novel that I would enjoy. And I think like the last time I actually saw a depiction of the gold rush, it was actually Charlie Chaplin. So it's going to be fun to read more about that era. And lastly but not leastly, Il Koskela, Lucia. And this is a graphic novel. And it's a Finnish graphic novel, not about the Finns in Sweden, but just purely Finnish. And this is actually about, basically witch hunts. It takes place in the 17th century in Finland. And, this is going to be a bit of a history lesson, but I'll try to keep it short. During that time, Finland was a part of Sweden. And I guess, like, Finland as a country didn't really exist yet. So they were like the Finnish territories, the place where there was mostly Finnish speakers. And we weren't exactly Christian yet. We weren't Christian almost at all when Sweden kind of made us a part of them. And one of the conflicts, there weren't that many conflicts, but one of the main conflicts between the Swedish people and the Finnish people was the religion. And Birger Jarl and other kings kind of had these campaigns where they tried to convert us to Christianity. And it was at times quite bloody, and I think like they even started the campaigns in the 14th century, so it took a long time before we were deconverted from pagan beliefs. And even if this is kind of something that has been kind of central in the relations in the past, it has not really been talked about that much. Now, this graphic novel actually takes up this issue and actually talks about a real case where there was a woman whose name was Lucia who got executed for witchcraft because she wouldn't give up these pagan beliefs in Finland that we had in Finland at the time. And it sounds really interesting. And unfortunately, I have looked inside, and the language is a little bit more difficult. It's more like old time Finnish, kind of like poetic language. Like if anybody knows what the Kalevala is, it's kind of like written with that kind of poetic rhythm, and it's a little bit older Finnish. And I'm not, due to the fact that I live in Sweden and I consume a lot of English media, then I don't read all that much in Finnish. So this might take a little while before I finish this, but I am really looking forward to this because I think like this is kind of a part of our history that kind of needs to be talked about, and I'm really excited that there finally is like a comic of old things talking about it. So really looking forward to this. Yeah. Well, so that was my very first book haul. Hope you guys liked it. And I will see you in the future.